Well, welcome once again. I don't know how many of you went into Lansdowne Meadows, but and I know we all want sunshine, but there's something mystical about being in a place like that when the fog is descended, etc. You sort of get a better sort of almost imagine. You can let your imagination go wild and think about the Norse and the Vikings being in that location. The last talk I had, I mentioned that it was my my maiden voyage, so to speak, and so this talk, perhaps, if we carry that one step further, maybe that's when I've got my sea legs a little bit here. I also have to apologize in advance for hiding behind the podium. I hurt my back, and so I'm gripping this podium more than hiding behind it. Okay. So we've been sailing. And we're now just departing from this vast coastline of Newfoundland and haven't even begun to actually think about sailing along Labrador. So I thought, although that was a wonderful spot that we stopped at, that you deserve to hear a little bit more about this place. Maybe you'll come back to it at some point. And so that's one of the reasons why I've picked this topic for my talk. This image is, for some of those of you who have been to St. John's, the capital, is a photo taken from probably a drone or something behind Signal Hill and looking in St. John's, looking back into the city with the Narrows in the foreground. And you can see obviously that it's a very protected harbor. I should make a note here before going any further that there are a couple of things I'm going to comment on I'm going to talk about in dollars, and when I say dollars, it's U.S. or American dollars. So in other words, 1 million Canadian dollars is worth $1 U.S. dollar. So just a little bit about. As you can see, that in terms of the topics here, I'm going to go back prior to the Norse and the Vikings coming here and talk a little about the history of the settlement, but then very quickly move to what I view as the big three resource exports that Newfoundland has taken part in over the last 100 years or so. And that's cod, hydroelectricity, and oil. And then turn to perhaps the next big one, and we'll see whether that's a bust as well, and that is tourism. And that fourth one is sort of political populism. I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but I wanted to really sort of help to explain maybe some of the decisions that were being made by the governments and others regarding investment in some of these big boom kinds of activities, and how the province has changed from a have-not to a have. And in one of my slides, I think it's got question marks. Maybe it's coming back to have province. And then I'm going to end up by actually, because it's great to talk about the place almost from being removed from a distance, but I'm going to give you 3 vignettes to better understand at least some of the people that call Newfoundland and Labrador home. The image you see here is Cabot Tower, or I guess Caboto Tower, on Signal Hill, St. John's Harbor. And this is part of the fortifications of the harbor, what the fortifications had been. But it's also, some of you might be aware if you visited here before, it's the site of a fairly important event. This is where the first transatlantic wireless message was received by Giovanni Marconi when he was in Cornwall, England. And in 1901, in Morse code, the letter S, in other words 3 dots, was sent across the Atlantic. I should say as well that there actually is some question about this because there's a lot of static, and so people believe that there are 3 dots, it was the letter S, but they didn't invested a lot of money in this as well. So it makes you wonder a little bit about how accurate that was. And then the other image on the bottom here is the Newfoundland provincial flag. The white background is supposed to represent snow and ice. The blue is for water, the red for human effort, and the gold for the confidence in the future. So just one slide on Newfoundland and Labrador today. First of all, and I know we've had this with several different presentations now, the official name is Newfoundland and Labrador. So that's the official name of the province, including the island and the end of the peninsula. And don't say Newfoundland. It's not three separate, it's all rolled together. And in fact, the emphasis is upon the last syllable, Newfoundland. Okay. It was the last province to enter Confederation in 1949, and in fact, the provinces before that, it was 45 years before that Saskatchewan and Alberta entered. So it was a long time coming before we added this 10th province to Confederation. The current population is about 550,000 people. So in other words, about the population of Halifax. And 95% of that population is on the Rock, which many people call Newfoundland, the Rock. And only about 5% are found on mainland Labrador, which is the eastern extent of the Ongava Peninsula that includes most of Quebec. Ethnicity, almost 88% of the population is European in origin, and most of those can trace their roots back to either English, Irish, or Scottish. And most of the remainder, the 10% or so, are Indigenous, and a mix of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and most of those, as you can imagine, would be in Labrador. The capital is St. John's, is located, is obviously named after Giovanni Caboto, John Cabot. And it's found, as you can see on that one image on the right-hand side, in the southeast corner of the province on the Avalon Peninsula. And you can imagine how the vast distances and the connectivity between that and Lansdowne Meadows. It's not just down the street. The population of St. John's is about 220,000 people. So it's very much what is referred to as a primate city. It's sort of not just population, but it controls the bulk of the economy, political power, and so on. In fact, the next largest city is Corner Brook at about 25,000 on the west coast, southwest coast of the province. A little bit about the history of the settlement and, in fact, the disappearance of various Indigenous groups. The first humans recorded in Newfoundland and Labrador appeared about 9,000 years ago in Labrador, and then about 5,500 years ago they moved down towards the island. This image on the right-hand side here, you can see that I've added these circles here. This represents what existed just prior to European colonization. And you can see the Beothuk are in Newfoundland, and the Inuit are in Labrador and primarily in northern Labrador on the coast. And the Innu are in the interior, and I had some notes here to myself to explain, but I'm not going to go into the details on what distinguishes one group from the other. I'd be happy to talk about that afterwards. The Beothuk are really for the island, we're really a fishing and hunting society. And with more Europeans arriving from about the 1500s on, they really retreated very quickly into the interior. And by 1829, they were extinct or virtually extinct. And currently, as I say, we have 4 different Indigenous groups here on the island: Mi'kmaq, and I mentioned that in my last talk, Mi'kmaq. Innu, Inuit, and the Southern Inuit, and you can see the distribution of them here. The 2021 Canadian census would put the total of all of those groups at just less than 50,000 people, with about half of those being First Nations. In other words, Mi'kmaq and Innu would be classified as First Nations. I'm only got one slide here because you've heard a lot about the Vikings up to now, and you're going to get another talk, I think, tonight on it. So I'm not going to spend virtually any time at all, but I must mention the Viking visits in brief. there's a lot of debate, and I don't know, there's really no clear definitive answer. But some researchers, in fact, I looked at the map on Lanzo Meadows and it concurs with this, believe that Vinland is a region and not a specific place. That's because the resources that they were looking for, like hardwood, grapes, butternuts, come from a variety of places to the south and west of Lanzo Meadows. And so this is a map you see here that was by Birgitta Wallace, who was an archaeologist with Parks Canada who unfortunately just passed away about a month ago. And it shows that Vikings explored or harvested in the summer along the coast of the Gulf of St. Lawrence and Prince Edward Island, likely. I should say as well that this map might go too far in that you can see those black lines going all the way down, almost all the way down the Gulf of, or the St. Lawrence River, the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, as well as in the interior of Labrador. And I'm not quite sure whether that might be extended a bit. But I think we're all agreed that at least having not discovered any other archaeological evidence, that Lanzo Meadows was the or one of the main sites, summering sites, or overwintering sites, where they went elsewhere for the summer. So as a geographer, even though I'm a human geographer rather than a physical geographer, I have to put a couple slides of the physical geography of the province in here and the geology. The island of Newfoundland, and notice I'm saying here just the island of Newfoundland, is part of the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, it's that northeast extension of the Appalachian Mountains. And it's about 1.2 billion years old. And that has occurred because of the collision of two plates or ancient continents. And I won't go into the details of Pangea and the sort of the ancient sort of geology of this. And so at one point along here, including in Newfoundland, the mountains were the size of the Alps or the Rocky Mountains before being eroded down to their present size. This image on the left, you can see, is actually from Labrador. And if you look at that blue area, you can see that actually is a different geological base. It's not the same as the island of Newfoundland. In fact, Labrador is part of that much larger, you can see, the Canadian Shield. And the Canadian Shield is much older. It's at least 2.5 billion years old, 2.5 to 2 billion years old. And it covers about 50% of the landmass of Canada. And if you've ever driven through there, maybe you've taken the train across Northern Ontario, you'll realize that it is mile after mile of bog and bedrock and stunted forest and lots of moose, but not necessarily very good for agriculture. I think you've actually seen this slide a couple times now, and it's a popular slide, but I wanted to mention it because you can't talk about Newfoundland without talking about the Grand Banks and the resources off of the shore of Newfoundland. That's an extension of the continental shelf of North America, and it extends 350 to 450 miles away from the landmass. It's shallower, much shallower water, so it's between 325 to 550 feet, before dropping tremendously down to a depth of between 3,500 and 10,000 feet. You can see from this map, the red line and the blue line, that it's important that this is an area where there's a mixture of both warm water currents and cold water currents. And what that does, it allows for a very, very rich marine environment, rich for marine life. And that produce that abundance of cod and other mammals, sea mammals as well. The other thing you should understand here is, and I'm going to be talking about this later on as we get closer to Iceland, is the importance of the United Nations as a Convention on the Law of the Sea, and the something called the EEZ or EEZ, the Exclusive Economic Zones. So that is an international agreement that was put in place. I think it was fully ratified in the 1980s. It was put in place in the 70s. But it bestows on the land masses around the water, or within that water, sort of certain rights and responsibilities. Out to 200 miles, the nation or the territory controls the resources, not only on the seabed, but also in the sea itself. And then if there's a continental shelf beyond that, a claim can be made to extend that control right out to the extent of that continental shelf. Therefore, Canada actually has the responsibility and the right to use its resources far further than that 200-mile limit. So I've titled this, It's All About the Cod. The early fishers felt that there was an unlimited supply of cod, and I know in one source, and I don't know whether this is might be an urban myth that I read this, but somebody said you could walk on their backs to get to shore. I don't think I'd want to take the chance of doing that. Originally, the fishers that scooped up the fish didn't have much of a land presence, and I think you've heard this before. They may have landed to repair their ships. They may have landed actually do some processing or drying of fish, but primarily some of the processing was done on ship, and then they took it right back to Europe. By the 20th century, there are hundreds of small coastal communities in Newfoundland completely dependent upon fishing. And so you can see from this image, the stocks collapsed in the early 1990s, and in 1992, the Canadian government put a moratorium on cod fishing. So in other words, no more commercial cod fishing. And that almost overnight ensured that 19,000 fishers were unemployed, and probably a multiple of that in terms of people that depended upon the fishers. And there are multiple causes for this, and they're all sort of linked causes. Obviously, the one cause is overfishing. Before 1977, in other words, before the conventional law of the sea, there was no 200-mile limit. So we had foreign deep-sea trawlers coming in and scooping fish and go back. But even after 1977, then the Canadian and foreign trawlers did a lot of this beyond the 200-mile limit, even though there was that continental shelf there. A second reason is technology had changed a lot over the years. And so some of those processing ships, they actually could handle and process, catch and process 15,000 tons of codfish a year. And finally, it's blamed on poor government mismanagement or poor government. They didn't enforce the quotas. They didn't cut down on the number of licenses that were issued. And the government scientists often overestimated the stock. So let's continue on this boom and bust. People still fish for cod, and if obviously you can't kiss a cod if the cod doesn't exist. So they still fish for cod, but the total now quota, I think the last year's total was only 18,000 tons of cod. So think about that in terms of what I had in the last slide. That represents only slightly more than the total cod that could be caught by one of those large processor trawlers. This image, you can see there that on the left, it's still part of the culture. They come from a ways, the visitors are being screeched in this cup glass. So the shot of local rum or moonshine, I have been screeched in. I don't have my certificate, but I have been screeched in. I think there's a picture somewhere that shows that. And I also recommend, if you get a chance to read it or get it, this book by Mark Kurlansky called Cod. And it shows how cod really changed the world. It's not just about Newfoundland, it's cod right throughout the North Atlantic and elsewhere. It's a wonderful book to read. Everything about cod that you're afraid to ask. So the second boom and bust, and that has to do with hydroelectricity and hydroelectric projects. Like many small islands, the economy of Newfoundland is very specialized, especially on resource sector. And because of that specialization, it's prone automatically to booms and busts because sectors go in a diversified economy, they often even each other out. The second boom and bust happened with the development and export of hydroelectricity. In other words, harnessing the water, and especially harnessing the water in Labrador. So first of all, there's a series of hydroelectric generating stations or dams near Churchill Falls in Labrador. And it's not just one, there's a series of multiple dams that are used, and then they feed into it. Well, how do you export it if it's way up in Labrador? Well, obviously, then you have to have that transmission corridor somewhere coming down, because the major markets are in the United States, in New England and elsewhere in the United States. And so Quebec was the only entity that was willing to invest in the money that Newfoundland needed in order to build the dams there. So they did that, and they had a 1969 contract that went for 40 years. And out of the course of that 40 years, Hydro-Quebec has made about $22 billion in it, and Newfoundland has made about $1.5 billion. So obviously there's a lot of, how would I say this, pissed off Newfoundlanders about that ongoing agreement, and felt, even though they entered into it, they still felt it was something that didn't really benefit them as much as it benefited their neighbors. Well, there's actually now a new agreement, because obviously that 40 years is up, and there's a new agreement, and the return to Newfoundland and Labrador went up just less than 3,000%. And you can see this image on the left-hand side, bottom left-hand side of the Premier at the time, ripping up the original contract between the province and Quebec. There is another hydroelectric project now that is being developed. And let me just go back here a little bit. And as you can see in that green circle and the arrow going down, that's called the Muskrat Falls development. The Muskrat Falls, so see, let's go forward here a bit. Nope, going back. Have to get my buttons right. So obviously what people in Newfoundland said, we're never going to go through Quebec again. We've been there, we've done that, we're not going to do it again. So instead, they decided that they're going to build a transmission corridor down below the Strait of Belle Isle, from Labrador into Newfoundland, and then from there down to Nova Scotia, and then down into the United States. It's not yet complete. The original cost was about $5.5 billion. It's now about $10 billion. And it actually is threatened to at one point it threatened to bankrupt the province. Until the Canadian government stepped in and provided a $5 billion loan guarantee, which is essentially a bailout to the provincial government. Even with that, the provincial government has to spend about $700 million a year just to ensure that the rates electricity rates for users in Newfoundland don't double. So in 2023, actually, the first stage of that was completed, and you now actually have the transmission corridor and a submerged corridor from Labrador down into Newfoundland. You still need to build the next one to Nova Scotia, and then through overland to the United States. The cost overruns are really because of government. The government exaggerated the benefits and downplayed the risks. And there's been actually an official royal inquiry to it that tried to get to the bottom of why the cost overruns existed. So let's look at this third a major resource investment, and I've already mentioned this a little bit if you watched my Halifax talk. And that's the discovery of offshore oil in the late 20th century in the Grand Banks, hundreds of miles from shore. So these aren't near-shore platforms. They're a long way away. The first one was the Hibernia field, and it's fundamentally changed the dynamics of the economy of the province. Now oil, and I say oil and gas, but it's mostly oil, constitutes 25% of the provincial economy, or gross provincial product, and more than 40% of the value of their exports. And just one oil platform, the Hibernia one, the first one, has generated about 11 billion in royalties or revenues to the coffers of the provincial government. And there's currently, as you can see here, I think this only shows 4, but there's 5 main fields. And it's estimated that they've extracted about 2 billion of the 3.3 estimated billion barrels of oil that's in that area. So what happens when the other 1.3 billion gets extracted? Now, as we can see, and this is actually a pleasant day out there, there's pretty harsh conditions in this part of the world, including icebergs impacting platforms. In fact, some platforms have been built to withstand icebergs up to 6 million tons, and other ones have been built, and some of the same ones have been built, so that there's a release that actually, if it does hit it, it can actually close off the pipes going down, and so that you wouldn't have a major oil spill. The other thing that you should be aware of course, is that there's no oil processing facility on Newfoundland. This is a ship, you can see on the right-hand side, carrying oil to Placentia Bay, the storage depot in Placentia Bay. And all that happens here is the oil is transmitted to Placentia Bay, and then it's put on supertankers and processed elsewhere. So you may be generating a lot of revenue, but you're not necessarily generating a lot of jobs for it. So tourism as development. How many of you, has any of you actually seen any of the ads, the tourism marketing ads from Newfoundland? Anybody? Well, maybe that's an example, indicator that it might not be that successful. But the tourism marketing, I watch these ads all the time. It's just wonderful to see them. It reminds me of the Icelandic ads as well. They're very good as well. But tourism market ads have won awards. Whether they're effective is maybe another question that we have to ask ourselves. Newfoundland is still primarily a resource-dependent export economy. Even 1/3 of the GDP is from all these resources. But there's an explicit strategy of the provincial government to try to at least expand tourism. But there are a lot of barriers. One is the seasonality of it. It's really a summer activity now, and they've tried to extend it to the shoulder seasons, but it's a hard sell. The other thing is there are a lot of what academics would call intervening opportunities. So look at places like Iceland and Norway. There's other places that sell themselves as with the same features. This emphasis upon unspoiled nature intertwined with heritage and culture, and they're all after the same group of tourists. So it's very expensive to get to Newfoundland, just as it's expensive to get to the others. So it still remains to be seen, although they did generate about $1 billion US in revenue, both from Canadians and non-Canadian tourists in the past year. But they do have some of the most memorable visual marketing, as you can see from some of the phrases on this, and their TV ads are wonderful as well. So I'm not going to go too much in the weeds about this, but I want to sort of talk a couple of slides about populist leaders. This image on the left-hand side is one of my favorite slides, by the way. The politics of booms and busts. Nationalism is obviously a feature of politics across many different places and times. At least in the case of Newfoundland, some people have called this resource nationalism or non-separatist nationalism. So unlike Quebec in Canada, or the Catalan region in Spain, or dare say Scotland in the UK, the ultimate goal of a place like Newfoundland, when they complain or build the tension up with the federal government, is not separation. What they're trying to do is sort of create a David versus Goliath type of scenario. And it's called Ottawa bashing. Everybody does it in Canada, Ottawa bashing. And so there was a question, a referendum on Confederation, whether Newfoundland and Labrador join Canada or not, was held. The referendum was held in 1948. And it only won by 7,000 votes. That's 52.3%. And most of the people that voted for Confederation were in the rural areas. Can talk about that another time, perhaps. So I want to mention a couple of examples of some of these populist leaders in Newfoundland, how they seem to have that charisma that just galvanizes people. The first one, the person on the right here, is Joey Smallwood. He was the first premier, and he served for 24 years. You can serve as long as you want, as long as your party continues to put you forward as a leader in Canada. He had a disagreement with the Prime Minister at the time, the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, John Diefenbaker, over the interpretation of the terms of joining Confederation. So he actually had officially announced 3 days of mourning where the flags were flown at half-mast because of that. The other one that I want to mention for a moment is Danny Williams, another populist kind of leader from 2003 to 2010. And he ran on the platform, "Stop giving away Newfoundland natural resources to others." A pretty simple kind of phrase, I guess. And it was his big issue, because there was an agreement on the terms between which Canada, federal government, and the provincial government would share revenue. He believed that they got a raw deal and he wanted to renegotiate it. And he said, well, who manages offshore oil and gas, and who gets to keep the money? So he demanded a renegotiation of the agreement, and essentially he won. Because the federal government, what they did was first of all, you can see him pointing to the flags. One of the things Danny Williams said, he removed all of the Canadian flags from the provincial buildings. But what they did was they had the revenues being generated from them removed from equalization payments. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But also the federal government gave them almost a signing bonus of $1.5 billion up front for it. So Newfoundland from a have-not to a have to a something province. You need to understand, and I'm only going to say this one slide, so don't worry about it. You need to understand the Canadian federal provincial system, and especially something called equalization payments, only in Canada. Provinces that do well economically are required to redistribute funds to provinces that aren't doing well, and they do it they're pooled through the federal government, and then they go back out again. It started in 1957, and in this coming year, this fiscal year, over $20 billion will be reinvested, or in total it has been acquired, and then it's going to be redistributed. In Newfoundland, they've been influenced obviously by the energy royalties, especially the oil. Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia have received nothing in equalization payments for the past 15 years. You might say, well, that's great, because that means they're doing quite well. Newfoundland and Labrador received payments from the start of the program right up until 2007. Then they received none, and they received none after that because oil was doing quite well. They actually became a have province. Until the most recent year, 24-25, when they've gone back to getting equalization payments, and that's largely because the world oil prices had dipped in that year, and all of a sudden they weren't making as much in terms of revenue. I want to just mention how Newfoundland compares to some other North Atlantic jurisdictions. And it's a very different kind of place than Iceland or Greenland or Faroes or others. It's one of obviously 10 provinces in a federation, a confederation. So unlike Greenland and the Faroes, it's not a territory. So the citizens have the same rights as citizens in every other province. Unlike Iceland or Norway, it's not a sovereign nation. So powers are shared in Newfoundland between the federal government and the provincial government. They have to work through those, whereas you wouldn't if it was a sovereign nation. And these political differences partly explain the differences in how it's approached economic development. Comparing Newfoundland to Iceland and Norway, here are a few of the similarities. That historic emphasis upon resource extraction sectors like fish, forest, minerals, oil, and gas. This image, you can see a couple of this. I just picked a couple stamps, one from the Faroes and one from Newfoundland, with a picture, either the picture of a cod on it or some young ladies processing some of the fish. Another similarity they have is that government policy has placed a major emphasis upon tourism in the last 5 to 10 years. And that nature-culture intertwining has been the major marketing focus of it. And third, many of these places have a concern about rural depopulation, and especially youth moving not only out of the rural areas, but off their islands completely. And in fact, in Newfoundland and Labrador, for many years, and the rest of the Maritimes, the Atlantic provinces, the youth left and went first to central Canada, Ontario, to work in the factories, and then they went to Alberta to work in the oil fields. And there's nothing of fly in and fly out. You work for 2 or 3 weeks, come back for 2 weeks, and you work for 2 or 3 weeks out there, paid for by the companies. And that's just a picture of some of the similar colorful houses in some of the jurisdictions. One of the big differences, and I apologize in advance for the quality of this slide, but you don't need to see it in detail. One of the big differences is where the political power lies within these jurisdictions. In Europe in general, and I am generalizing a bit here, municipalities, you've got really a two-tier government. A lot of power and the ability to tax at the municipal level, and a lot of power at the federal level. But there's the role of the state or the province is I wouldn't say almost non-existent, but it's nowhere near as strong as it is in North American North American jurisdictions. So Europe has stronger rural power because most of the municipalities would be in the rural areas. So how is this expressed? In Iceland and Norway, you can see them spending large amounts to maintain access to small communities in tunnels and bridges. In Newfoundland, there's an explicit policy to relocate in the small communities. And so in 1960, there were 1,200 Newfoundland communities, and 50% of them had fewer than 100 people in them. So the provincial government says we need to rationalize this. We need to be more efficient. And so they actually then, they didn't force people to move, but they paid stipends in a program to encourage people to move. And everybody in the community had to agree to it in order to have them move to a larger community where presumably there would be better services, more job opportunities, and so on. And from the 1950s and 1970s, 300 rural communities were vacated through this policy. And 20,000 people were relocated. It was popular, but there's also, you can imagine, anger and tension there, because I imagine there's a lot of pressure on those 1 or 2 holdouts in that community if they don't want to do it. Oh, sorry, I should show you that. Those black dots and dots here represent the communities that were either vacated or the places that they went to, the black and red dots. Oops, get my dots right. I thought this was a great image as well. This is an image. The initial versions of the program that was rolled out said that you could bring your house with you. So you didn't have to necessarily leave your house behind. And there are examples that you can see here that people actually took their houses with them. I think later versions of the program realized maybe we've made a mistake here, and they didn't allow them to bring their houses and just had cash payouts here. But there was a basic grant of $700 per household, plus another $150 for every person in the very early 1970s if you moved. And that sounds like a pittance, but you have to remember that at the time, the average fisher was only going to earn about $600 or $700 a year in fishing. So let's, in the last 12 or 13 minutes here, I want to talk about the people. And the first one I want to talk about is the seal fishery or the seal hunt, depending on who you are. The Inuit have been hunting seal for over 3,000 years. Commercial hunting of the seal really only emerged in the latter half of the 19th century, and it's largely for seal oil for city lights and in soaps and leather tanneries. They were harvesting about 300,000 seal a year during this period, mainly harp and gray seal. It decreased in the early 20th century, to about $150,000 seal a year, and that's largely because they no longer needed them for the oil. And in 1971, there was a quote of 200,000, and that was shared equally between Canadian companies and Norwegian companies, interestingly. And many of you might remember that the 1970s were a lot of protests. In fact, I think Brigitte Bardot and Paul McCartney were out on the seaflows as well, protesting it. And there was a European Union ban on white coats, in other words, seal pups, put in place in 1986. And the protests continued right up until the European Union banned all sea products completely. So the 2014 quota was 400,000, and only 50,000 seals were actually harvested. And now it's less economic and more cultural. I should say there was an exemption in the agreement that Inuit would still be allowed to harvest seal and sell it. But the problem was protesters and others, the market, couldn't distinguish between what seals had been harvested by the Inuit and what seals had been harvested by commercial. So they didn't actually even benefit from the exemption. From one perspective, I can understand all perspectives, but the Newfoundlanders feel that this is a lack of recognition of the seal as a part of the community and family culture. And I didn't mention that. There's an interesting quote there, and I won't even bother saying it because my mother would be upset if I swore, so I won't say that. So it's not part of not just the Inuit culture, and it's part of the, I would say, European origin community culture as well, because it's been part of their culture for 100 and plus years as well. You can see the images, the traditional kamiks and the boots. If you saw that movie, the documentary, you saw a couple of them putting their kamiks on. Image on the left, you can see them drawing some of the seal pelts, and this may even be in around the Strait of Belle Isle here that they're doing it. And then down here you see a dish of seal flipper pie, and that actually seal flipper pie is almost like a pastry, and it was actually produced and sold, or produced and eaten when the fishers came back from the seal hunt as a traditional welcome back meal. So understanding the people second, gander and what gander is represented. In the pre-jet age era of air flight, planes didn't have the range to fly between Europe or Britain and the major centers of North America. So the British decide, in collaboration with at this time the country of Newfoundland, to establish a refueling stop. And this image on the left, you can see the gander this is part of the Great Circle route getting across here. And it was completed in 1939, and at the time it was the largest in the world. They initially started with 4 4,500-foot runways, and then they expanded those to 10,000-foot runways. And think of the timing of it, 1939, so just before the World War II. And when the war broke out, this became the largest air base in the world. Image at the top right, you can see some of the Hudson bombers. So 20,000 airplanes, in fact, 20,000 aircraft went through here during World War II, and was used a lot as a pilot training grounds as well. So after World War II, and after Newfoundland is part of Canada, it was still being used for civil aviation, for freight, etc. And because the jet engines, passenger engines, still hadn't taken off pardon the pun, yet. And so Canada decided to invest some money in here. It was called sort of the crossroads of the world. And so they actually invested a lot of money and hired some excellent designers and architects to make one of the nicest looking air terminals that you could ever see, and some of the best designers. But the jet engine age killed most of the traffic. There's still some planes that go there. So this is almost like a terminal that's lost in time. Until September 11th, 2001. and the U.S. American airspace was closed after the terrorist attacks. And all of the transatlantic planes needed to find airports that had runways long enough to land in. So in Gander, in the course of one day, 38 planes landed with 7,000 passengers. And the passengers had to stay in the planes for the first 24 hours. And then the town of 10,000 people started putting the passengers up in their homes, in the churches, in the town halls, and so on. And it's just a couple of quotes by the locals here in terms of what they felt about their role in this. And it's retold in that book. You see the book jacket there. And how many of you actually have seen Come From Away? A number of you have seen Come From Away. It's been shown, it was shown 1,669 times in Broadway, 855 times in Toronto, and it's been shown in a number of other places as well. The very powerful images of how Gander reacted to that extreme incident. The third and last one I mentioned is understanding the people is Newfoundland comedy. And several, in fact, some of the best and well-known Canadian comedians come out of Newfoundland. And they've aired off and on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. One example is the series Codco, short for Cod Company, from 1988 to 1993. And that evolved into a show that's still on television called This Hour is 22 Minutes. I watch it every Tuesday night, by the way. And it's based on satiric comedy. A lot of the comedy in Newfoundland is based on satire, on political and everyday events. The image on the right, Rick Mercer was a well-known actor and comedian on This Hour is 22 Minutes, as was Mary Walsh, both Newfoundlanders. Now, when I was young, it wasn't uncommon to make fun of people from Newfoundland and call them Newfies. That was a derogatory term to use. And what the comedians have done is have turned that on its head. And so they actually try to make fun of the self-deprecating humor, make fun of themselves to show their own young and youth that there's nothing wrong with us. They also, so therefore, raised Newfoundlanders' image and self-esteem by doing that. And some people say that part of the success of the comedians in Newfoundland has to do with that the kitchen parties and the emphasis upon music and on singing and dancing and so on, and the sort of the review tradition, our revue tradition, where it wasn't uncommon in households for that to be there's almost to be a performance in the household and in the community. So I just wanted to give you those examples of just a few of the groups of Newfoundlanders that make up this wonderful province. And if you do get a chance to come back at some point, please do so. I'll just go to the last slide here. My next talk is this coming Tuesday at 6:30 at night. And it's titled Greenland, the Faroes, and Denmark, A Complicated Relationship. Thank you very much.